a warrior who once stood as a shining protector of an ancient empire, and who fell so far that he became one of the most feared destroyers the world of Runeterra has ever known. He began as a hero worthy of song, a being lifted above mortal life to guard his people, and he ended as a creature who wants only to burn everything down to ash, including himself. Over the next while, we will walk through his entire path, from the golden age when he was celebrated as a champion of the light, through the long and ruinous war that hollowed him out, into the age when he and his kind turned against the very world they had sworn to defend. We will follow him into his prison, into his slow and terrible return, and into the mind of the being he became, the one who calls himself the World Ender. It is a long fall, and it is worth telling slowly, because the tragedy of Aatrox only makes sense when you understand how far he had to drop to reach the bottom. So let the sands of old Shurima drift across your mind as we begin at the beginning, in an age of gods and giants, when a great civilization ruled the deserts, and Aatrox was counted among its finest sons. Before we sail through the sands, I want to appreciate you choosing our video among the hundreds or thousands on YouTube to fall asleep. It is my honor to present my esteemed guest this story, so they keep coming back for more amazing ones, and subscribe to my channel. Long before the borders of the modern world were drawn, before the great cities of today rose from stone and steel, there was Shurima. It was an empire of the sun, spread across vast deserts and green river valleys, and for a time it was the brightest thing the world had ever produced. Its people built towers that caught the dawn. They raised libraries filled with knowledge, and they watched over trade routes that stretched to the horizon in every direction. At the heart of this civilization stood a single, blazing wonder, a great disk of gold suspended above the capital, a relic of unimaginable power that the Shuriman people had learned to use. That disk was the source of their greatest miracle. Through a rite performed beneath its light, a chosen mortal could be raised up into something far greater than a person, a being of enormous strength and grace, who would no longer age, no longer sicken, and no longer fall to the ordinary limits of flesh. These transformed champions were called the Ascended, and to their own people they were often known as the Sunborn. They were the guardians of the Empire, its living weapons and its living saints, and they were regarded almost the way later generations would come. To regard gods, to become one of them, was the highest honor a mortal could earn. The rite was not offered lightly, and it went to the bravest, the wisest, and the most devoted, to those who had proven their worth in battle or in service to the Empire and its people. When the light of the disk washed over a chosen mortal, their body was remade, grown taller and stronger, their form crowned with the marks of their new station, and their old life ended so that a far longer one could begin. The Ascended stood between ordinary people and every horror that might threaten them, and for generations they did that work well. Among these champions, Aatrox rose to a rare kind of fame. He was not simply strong, though he counted among the strongest. He was not simply skilled, though few could match him with a blade. What set him apart was the way he carried himself, and the way others came to see him. To the soldiers who marched beside him, he stood as proof that the fight could be won. To the ordinary people of the Empire, he became a shield they could name and trust. When he took to the field, courage seemed to spread outward from him like heat from a fire, and men who had been ready to flee found reasons to stand. The truth of Aatrox's mortal life, the years he lived before the disk remade him, has been lost almost entirely to time. So much has crumbled since those days that the name he carried as an ordinary man, the family he came from, the home he first knew. None of it survives in any account we can trust. What we can say is that whoever he had been, he earned his place among the Ascended through deeds the Empire judged worthy of its greatest gift, and that once he became one of the Sunborn, he grew into a symbol far larger than any single soldier could ever be. For a long stretch of years, this was simply who Aatrox was, a protector, a warrior of the light whose reputation ran ahead of him wherever the banners of Shurima flew. He fought in the Empire's wars, he guarded its borders, and he defended its people from the dangers that lurked beyond the reach of ordinary armies. There was a nobility to him in those days that later ages would find almost impossible to imagine, given what he became. Yet it was real, and it matters, because the being who would one day try to unmake the world started out as one of its most devoted defenders. Picture him as his own people saw him then, a towering figure clad for war, moving at the head of gleaming columns, his presence alone worth 1,000 spears. He believed in something, in the Empire, in the light of the sun, in the duty he had accepted when the disk changed him. That belief formed the core of him, the thing that made him who he was. Hold on to that image, because everything that follows is the story of what happens when a being like that has his belief taken apart, piece by piece, until nothing remains but the wreckage. The Ascended were meant to be permanent, in a sense. They did not age as mortals did, and they guarded the Empire across long centuries, outlasting the ordinary generations that rose and fell beneath them. In a kinder history, Aatrox might have gone on that way for age after age, a fixed star in Shurima's sky, remembered forever as one of its greatest heroes. But the history of Shurima was not kind, and the threat that would break him was no rival empire and no mortal enemy. It was something far older and far worse, something that should never have been allowed into the world at all. To understand what happened to Aatrox, you have to understand the war that changed everything, the war against the void. And to understand that, you have to travel to a place within the Empire where pride and desperation curdled into the worst mistake mortals have ever made. That place was Icathia. It began as one of Shurima's own, a province of the Empire, a people who lived and thrived under the same sun that gave the Ascended their power. For a long time, Icathia was loyal, a part of the greater whole, sharing in the prosperity that the Empire spread across the land. But loyalty is a fragile thing, and beneath the surface of that prosperity, resentment had begun to grow. The people of Icathia came to feel that they lived in the shadow of the Ascended rather than under their protection. They saw how the Empire's power flowed through those chosen champions, how the mightiest gifts went only to the Sunborn, and how ordinary men, no matter how clever or ambitious, could never truly rival them. Pride festered into rebellion, and Icathia broke from the Empire, determined to prove that it did not need the Ascended, that it could stand as an equal and even a rival to Shurima itself. That defiance alone might have led only to an ordinary war, the kind the Empire had weathered before. What made Icathia's rebellion into a catastrophe was the weapon its leaders chose to reach for. Deep beneath their land lay something ancient and sealed, a wound in the world, a place where the ordinary rules of reality wore thin and something vast and hungry pressed against the edges of existence. This was the void, an emptiness that predated the world and wished only to return the world to emptiness. The rulers of Icathia knew, at least dimly, what lay beneath them, and in their desperation to win their war, they decided to use it. They believed they could open the way to the void and wield its power like a blade against the empire that they hated. It was the reasoning of the drowning, the logic of people so certain of their own defeat that any weapon, no matter how terrible, seemed worth the risk. They tore open the seal, and for a heartbeat they may have believed they had triumphed. What poured through was not a weapon that any mortal hand could hold. The void does not serve. It consumes. And it unmade Icathia almost at once, twisting the land and the people who had summoned it into shapes that no longer belonged to the living world. The rebels who had thought themselves masters became the first victims, and the horror they had loosed did not stop at their borders. Instead it spread outward, and the empire that Icathia had wanted to defeat now faced a danger that could swallow not only Shurima, but everything beyond it. This is the war that would remake Aatrox, the war against the void, and it was unlike anything the Ascended had faced before. Ordinary enemies could be beaten and driven back. Ordinary wars had shapes and rules and endings. The void had none of these. It did not tire, it did not fear, and it did not stop. Every creature it produced existed only to devour and to spread the emptiness further, and behind those creatures lay an intelligence, or something like an intelligence, that seemed to understand the world only well enough to want it gone. The Ascended answered the call as they always had. Shurima gathered its sunborn champions and sent them into the breach, and Aatrox was among them, one of the greatest weapons the Empire could bring to bear. In the early days of that war, he was still the hero he had always been, a shield for his people, a light thrown against a rising dark. He fought the way heroes are supposed to fight, with courage and with faith that the cause was just and that the light would hold. For a time, the Ascended held the line. They were mighty beyond mortal reckoning, and they threw themselves against the horror with everything they had. Where they stood, the void's advance slowed. Where their weapons fell, its creatures died. If the war had been short, the story might have ended there, with the Sunborn victorious and Aatrox returning home in triumph, another chapter added to his legend. But the war was not short. It was the longest and worst thing any of them had ever known, and it ground on and on and on. Here is the thing about fighting the void that the songs never quite capture. It is not only dangerous to the body, it is corrosive to the mind. The creatures the Ascended fought were wrong in a way that reached past armor and flesh and settled into the soul. To look upon them was to feel the world you believed in start to slip, to sense that beneath the sky and the sun and the solid earth there was only a vast and patient hunger waiting to reclaim it all. Day after day, year after year, the Sunborn stared into that truth, and it began to leave marks on them that no wound ever could. They watched their comrades fall, not in the clean way of ordinary death, but in ways that unmade everything the fallen had been. They fought battles that seemed to lead nowhere, winning ground only to see the emptiness seep back into it. They began to understand that the enemy they faced could not be reasoned with, could not be bargained with, and perhaps could not truly be beaten, only held at bay for as long as their strength lasted. And strength, even the strength of the Ascended, has limits. Slowly the war hollowed them out. The champions who had marched into the breach so full of faith came out, when they came out at all, as something changed. Some carried a haunted look that never left them. Some grew cruel, hardened past the point of feeling. Some simply broke, their minds unable to hold the weight of what they had seen. The Void War did to the Ascended what no mortal enemy ever could. It took the finest beings the world had made and began to teach them despair. Aatrox did not escape this, nor could he have. He had gone into that war as its brightest champion, and the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow it casts when it begins to fail. Every horror the war held, he faced. Every friend it claimed, he mourned. Every certainty he had carried, the faith in the Empire, the faith in the sun, the faith that the light was destined to win, was tested against a darkness that refused to yield, and one by one, those certainties began to crack. Understand that this was not a single moment of falling. It was slow. It was the wearing away of a great stone by an endless tide, the grinding down of something that had seemed unbreakable. The Aatrox who had believed in his cause did not vanish overnight. He was worn thin across a war that outlasted the patience of the world, and by the time it was over, or as close to over as it would ever get, the being who emerged was no longer the hero who had gone in. The war had been won, in the sense that the void was pushed back and sealed away once more, though at a cost so great that it broke the age that followed. And the survivors, Aatrox among them, carried wounds that no victory could heal. That is the cruelty at the heart of his story. He did the right thing. He answered the call. He fought the great evil. He paid a price that few beings could have paid. And doing the right thing did not save him. It destroyed him. The war he won took from him the very thing that had made him worth saving, and it left him standing in the ruins of his own faith, a hero with nothing left to believe in. The void was pushed back, but the empire that had sent its champions to fight it would not stand much longer, and when Shurima fell, the last supports beneath the broken Ascended fell with it. To follow Aatrox from here, we have to watch not only a man break, but a whole civilization collapse, and see what rises from those who were once its greatest guardians when there is nothing left for them to guard. Shurima did not last forever. The empire that had raised the disc and forged the Ascended eventually met its own end, its capital falling into ruin, its people scattered, its golden age fading into memory and then into legend. Those details of the collapse belong to other stories, but for Aatrox and those like him, the meaning of it was simple and devastating. Everything they had sworn to protect was gone. The empire they had bled for, the people they had shielded, the cause that had given their long lives shape and purpose, all of it crumbled into the sand. Think about what that meant for a being like Aatrox. He had already been hollowed out by the war against the void, his faith in the light long gone, his certainty that good would triumph worn away, his belief that the fight was worth the price broken. The one thing he might still have clung to was duty, the simple fact of having something to defend, and now even that was taken from him. His empire no longer existed. The people he protected were gone or scattered, and what remained was an immortal weapon in a world that no longer had a war for him to win or a home for him to return to. This is the ground from which the Darkin grew. The word describes what certain of the Ascended became after the Empire fell and the war had broken them, the champions who did not simply grieve their losses, but were twisted by them into something monstrous. Not all of the Ascended fell this way. Some held on to what they had been, but others, and Aatrox was among the greatest of these, curdled. The grief and the rage and the emptiness inside them had nowhere to go, and it turned outward, and it turned dark. The transformation was not only in the spirit, for it marked their bodies as well. Reaching for forbidden power, for blood magic and darker arts, the fallen Ascended sought strength to match the fury that consumed them, or sought simply to feel something other than the void inside. Their forms changed under the weight of it. Noble figures who had once inspired awe warped into towering, terrible shapes, their skin darkening and hardening, their features sharpening into something that no longer looked like a protector and looked instead like a nightmare given flesh. The Sunborn had been beautiful in the way of the dawn, and the Darkin were beautiful in the way of a blade, cold and cruel, and made for killing. Where once these beings had fought to save the world, now they fought to rule it, or to ruin it. The Darkin became warlords, carving out domains through terror and slaughter, turning the very power that had made them protectors into an engine of conquest. The people who had once looked upon the Ascended as saviors now fled before them, because the Darkin did not save. They took, they burned, and they ground the world beneath them, and they answered to nothing but their own bottomless hunger for something that could never be filled. Aatrox's fall was the sharpest and the most bitter of them all, because he had climbed the highest. The champion who had spread courage like heat from a fire now spread dread. The shield his people had trusted became the blade that struck them down. Everything that had made him noble was inverted, turned inside out, and what remained was a warrior of unmatched skill, with no cause left to serve but destruction. He had been the finest of the Sunborn. He became the most feared of the Darkin. And feared he was. Among the Darkin, Aatrox stood apart, regarded as the greatest warrior of them all. The others were terrible in their own right, each a fallen champion with power enough to level armies, but Aatrox was something more, a peak that even the other Darkin measured themselves against. When they spoke of might, they spoke of him. When they imagined the strongest blade in the world, it was his. In a brotherhood of monsters, he was the one the others watched most carefully, because his strength was the kind that could not be safely turned upon. It is worth pausing here to sit with the horror of what had happened, because it is easy to say the words that a hero fell, that a protector became a destroyer, without feeling the true weight of them. Imagine the being who had once stood at the head of gleaming columns, whose presence alone could turn a rout into a rally. Imagine the faith the ordinary people had placed in him, the way they had spoken his name as a comfort against the dark. And then imagine that same being turning upon them, using every skill he had learned in their defense to instead hunt them down. The tragedy is not only in what he did, it is in the memory of what he had been, a memory that made the fall so much harder to bear. The Darkin were never a united family, though it might be tempting to imagine them so. They were rivals as much as they were kin, each pursuing his own ends, each as likely to turn on the others as to stand beside them. What bound them was not love or loyalty, but a shared nature, the shared curse of being what they were. They had all fallen from the same height, all been broken by the same war and the same collapse, and all been remade into the same kind of monster. But that common origin did not make them allies so much as it made them reflections of one another, each seeing in the others the ruin of what they themselves had become. For Aatrox, even that grim fellowship offered little. He was, in the end, a solitary kind of horror, singular in his skill and singular in the depth of his fall. Where some of the Darkins sought power or pleasure or dominion, driven by appetites that at least resembled the wants of living things, Aatrox was being ground down towards something colder and emptier, a nihilism that would eventually swallow every other desire. But that came later. In the age of the Darkin warlords, he was simply the greatest killer in a world of killers, a former god of the sun who now moved through the land like a shadow of the death he dealt. The world could not survive this indefinitely. Too powerful, too cruel, and too many. The Darkin would have ground every mortal kingdom to dust if left unchecked, ruling over a wasteland of their own making until there was nothing left to rule. The very people the Ascended had once protected now faced extinction at the hands of their former guardians, and the ordinary races of the world understood that if they did nothing, they would be erased. And so, out of desperation and out of the simple will to survive, the mortals of Runeterra began to look for a way to fight back against beings that seemed impossible to defeat. How do you kill a god who has become a devil? How do you stop a being who cannot age, cannot sicken, and cannot be laid low by any ordinary weapon or mortal hand? That was the problem the world faced, and the answer, when it came, would require knowledge from beyond the ordinary world, wisdom drawn from the heights of the heavens themselves. To find the weapon that could bring down the Darkin, mortals would have to look upward, to the great mountain where the celestial powers touched the earth, and to the strange and dangerous knowledge that lived there. The place the mortals looked toward was Targon, the great mountain that rises higher than any other in the world, its peak lost among the stars. Targon has always been more than a mountain. It is a threshold, a point where the ordinary world and the vast celestial heavens above it press close together, and where beings of immense cosmic power, the aspects, can reach down and touch the lives of mortals. The knowledge that lived at the top of that mountain was not the knowledge of ordinary men. It was the wisdom of the heavens, ancient and strange, and it held answers that could be found nowhere else. It was from this celestial knowledge that the means to defeat the Darkin was drawn. The mortals learned a hard truth, that beings like the Darkin could not truly be killed in the way ordinary things are killed. Strike down their bodies and their essence would remain, unwilling and unable to die, ready to rise again. A slain Darkin was not a defeated Darkin. To simply cut one down solved nothing, because there was no death waiting at the end of the blow, only a pause before the horror returned. If the world was going to be rid of them, it would need something other than mere destruction. What the mortals devised, with the wisdom they had gained, was not death, but imprisonment. If a Darkin could not be killed, then it could be bound, its essence trapped and sealed away where it could do no harm. And the vessels chosen for this binding held a terrible irony at their heart. The Darkin were sealed inside weapons, inside the very blades and instruments of war that they had used to ravage the world. The essence of each fallen champion was drawn out of its monstrous body and locked within a weapon, so that the thing which had been a living engine of slaughter became instead a silent object, beautiful and deadly and still. For Aatrox, the vessel was a great sword, an enormous blade fit for the mightiest of the Darkin. Into that sword his essence was poured and sealed, and the towering monster that had terrorized the world was reduced to a weapon lying quiet upon the ground. To the eye, it was simply a magnificent great sword, the kind of relic a warrior might dream of wielding. But within it, something was still awake. Within it, Aatrox remained, and this is where his story turns from tragedy into something close to nightmare. Consider what it means to be sealed inside a sword, not killed, not put to sleep, not granted the mercy of oblivion, but sealed, which is to say, trapped, conscious, aware, and utterly unable to act. Aatrox did not die when he was bound into the blade. He did not lose himself in some merciful dark. He remained thinking and feeling, a mind locked inside an object that could not move, could not speak, and could not end. For a being who could not truly die, imprisonment was not a punishment with a limit. It was a sentence without end, and every moment of it was fully felt. Sit with that horror for a moment, slowly, because it is the hinge on which everything else turns. Imagine being awake but unable to move a single muscle because you have no muscles left to move. Imagine being able to think but having nothing to think about except your own imprisonment, hour after hour, year after year, with no change and no relief, and no hope of change or relief. Imagine that the ordinary escape of death, the release that even the most wretched mortal can eventually count on, is closed to you because you cannot die. That was Aatrox's existence inside the sword. Not moments of it, not years of it, but ages of it. Centuries poured past like water, and he remained, awake in the dark, unable to do anything but endure. There is a particular cruelty in this kind of imprisonment that goes beyond simple suffering. A living thing in pain can at least hope for the pain to end, whether through healing or through death. Aatrox had neither hope. He could not heal his way out of the sword, because the sword was not a wound but a cage, and he could not die his way out of it, because death had been taken from him. What was left to him was only time, endless and empty, and a mind that had already been broken by war and by the fall of everything he loved, now given nothing to do but turn over its own ruin again and again in the silent dark. It would be a mistake to think this imprisonment left him unchanged, that he simply waited inside the blade as the being he had been. Ages of that kind of confinement do things to a mind. Whatever was left of the noble Aatrox, whatever fragments of the Protector might still have lingered beneath the Darkin monster, were worn away by the centuries in the dark. What remained hardened into something colder and more absolute. If he had hated the world before, now that hatred had nothing to compete with it, no distraction, no purpose, no hope, only the pure and patient fury of a being who had been given eternity to nurse his wounds. And through all of it, one thing became clearer and clearer to him. He wanted it to end. Not his imprisonment only, though he wanted that too. He wanted everything to end, himself included. The mortal world had made him, used him, broken him, and then locked him away conscious in a cage he could not escape. What could such a being come to want, given ages alone to want it, but an ending, an oblivion, a final silence that would swallow his suffering and everything else along with it? The seeds of the world ender were sown in that sword, in the long dark centuries when Aatrox had nothing to do but hate and nothing to hope for but the end. But swords do not stay buried forever. They are found, they are picked up, they are wielded. And a weapon that contains a trapped and furious god is not a safe thing for any mortal to hold. The binding that had contained Aatrox was strong, but it was not a true death. And a being who cannot die is a being who can, given the right circumstances, return. The mortals who had sealed the Darkin away had solved the problem of their own age. They had not solved it forever. And when Aatrox's sword was finally lifted again by a mortal hand, the long imprisonment would end, and something far worse would begin. The sword did not stay lost. Across the long ages after the Darkin were sealed away, their weapons drifted through the world, passing from hand to hand, buried and unearthed, hidden and found again. To most who came across them, these blades seemed only to be relics of extraordinary make, weapons of terrible beauty that any warrior would covet. That was the trap. Because the moment a mortal took up Aatrox's sword and tried to make it their own, the true nature of the thing revealed itself, and the trapped god within began to wake. Here is how the horror works. A wielder lifts the blade, drawn by its power, believing they have found a weapon worthy of them. And the weapon reaches back. Aatrox, awake inside the steel, and starving for release after ages of confinement, pours himself into the one who holds him. His will is not a mortal will. It has been sharpened by centuries of hatred and hardened by an eternity of imprisonment, and against it an ordinary mind has no defense. The wielder believes they command the sword. In truth, the sword is beginning to command them. Slowly at first, and then all at once, Aatrox overwhelms the one who holds him and takes them for his own. What follows is not possession in the gentle sense of a spirit whispering in someone's ear. It is a conquest of the body itself. Aatrox does not merely influence his host, he consumes them, unmaking who they were and using their flesh as raw material to rebuild himself. The mortal who lifted the blade is erased, their body reshaped into a vessel for the Darkin within, twisted and grown into a towering echo of the monster Aatrox had been in the age of Shurima. From the stolen flesh of his wielder, he builds himself a new form, and the being who had been trapped as a silent weapon stands once more upon the earth, terrible and free. But the form he builds this way is not truly his own, and it will not last. This is one of the cruelest parts of his cursed existence. The body Aatrox constructs from a stolen host is a borrowed thing, a shell that cannot properly hold the vast and ruined power of a Darkin, and so it decays even as he wears it, breaking down, wearing away at the edges, failing and rotting around the terrible essence it contains. The flesh cannot keep pace with what lives inside it, and so his physical form is always dying, always crumbling, no matter how mighty it appears in the moment. This decay is why his return is never an ending, but a cycle. Because the stolen body fails, Aatrox must find another. He must seek out new wielders, new hosts, new flesh to consume and reshape over and over across the ages. Each host buys him only a span of time before the rot sets in and the form begins to collapse. And then he must move on to the next, drawn always to the strongest bodies he can find, because a stronger host lasts longer and serves him better. The pattern of his existence, once he returned to the world, became a grim hunt without end, a search for flesh to burn through in the pursuit of his greater goal. There is something almost mechanical in the horror of it, and something deeply sad. Aatrox is not building toward a life. He is not seeking a home or a throne or a lasting body in which to dwell in peace. He is simply keeping himself walking, host after host, form after form, so that he can carry on doing the one thing left to him. The bodies are fuel. The wielders who dreamed of glory when they lifted his blade become nothing more than the next brief vessel for a being who used them up and cast them aside. Every one of them thought the sword was a gift. Every one of them was wrong. And what does he seek? Once he walks again. What is the purpose that drives him to consume host after host, to keep his crumbling form moving across the world? It is not conquest in the old Darkin way, the carving out of domains and the ruling over the fearful. Aatrox has moved past that. The nihilism that took root in the sword has grown into the whole of him, and the thing he wants now is larger and darker than any warlord's dream. He wants an ending, not just his own, though he wants that most of all. He wants the ending of everything, and he has come to believe that the only way to reach the oblivion he craves is to drown the entire world in a war so vast that nothing survives it. That is the being who returned from the sword, not the noble protector of Shurima, long since burned away. Not even the conquering warlord of the early Darkin Age, driven by hunger and dominion. Something further gone than either, a creature who wields the flesh of the living as a tool and who marches through the world with a single, terrible purpose: that he pursues with all the skill of the greatest warrior the world ever made. He came back wearing a dead man's body, wielding a blade that had once been his prison, carrying an eternity of hatred and looking for a way to end all things. To wield Aatrox's sword, then, is to lose everything: your body, your will, your very self, swallowed by a god who wants the world dead. The warning is written into every account of him, though few who find the blade ever heed it in time. And the being those unfortunate wielders unleash upon the world has a name that captures exactly what he has become. They call him the World Ender, and to understand what that title truly means, we have to look at the mind of Aatrox as he is now, at the hatred that fills him and the vast, ruinous purpose he has set himself upon. To sit inside the mind of Aatrox as he is now is to sit inside a very old and very deep hatred, one that has had ages to settle and to spread until it covers everything. He does not hate the way a mortal hates, in flashes and fevers that cool with time. His hatred is total, and it is patient, and it reaches in every direction at once. The gods draw his fury first, those great celestial powers who watched the world and did nothing to spare him his fall. He hates mortals too, the small and fragile creatures who made him, used him, broke him, and locked him away. And beneath both of those he hates existence itself, the simple fact of being, the whole arrangement of a world that could produce so much suffering and offer no escape from it. Think about where that hatred comes from, because it is not senseless. Aatrox was raised up to protect. He believed in the cause he served. He gave everything, faced the worst horror the world had ever known, and won a war that few could have won, and his reward for all of it was ruin. His faith was shattered, his empire fell, his very nature was twisted into a monster, and then he was sealed conscious inside a blade for ages, beyond counting. From where he stands, the world did not simply fail him. It tortured him, methodically, across an eternity, for the crime of having tried to do good. A being who has lived through that does not arrive at gentle conclusions. So he looks at the gods, and he sees powers that could have intervened, and chose not to. He looks at mortals, and he sees the architects of his cage, the makers of the weapon that trapped him, the endless parade of small, hungry lives that took up his sword, and dreamed of glory while he suffered inside it. And he looks at the world entire, at the whole cycle of creation and struggle and death, and he decides that the only mercy left in a place like this is to end it, not to rule it, not to reform it, to bring it to a close so completely that nothing remains to suffer, himself first and last among them. This is what the title of World Ender truly means. It is not a boast about how many he can kill or how much he can burn, though he can burn a great deal. It is a statement of purpose. Aatrox has set himself the goal of igniting a war so vast, so total, so all-consuming, that it does not end with one side victorious, but with everything destroyed. He wants a final war, the last war, the one that leaves no survivors, no kingdoms, no gods, no mortals, and no world for any of them to stand upon. He believes that in the heart of such a war lies the oblivion he has craved since the long dark centuries in the sword, and he intends to build that war with his own hands. There is a strategy to this, cold and deliberate. Aatrox does not simply rampage, though he is more than capable of slaughter. He seeks out places where conflict already smoulders, and he feeds it. He finds the seams of hatred that run through the mortal world, the old wounds and the fresh grievances, and he presses on them until they tear open into violence. Wherever war might be kindled, he kindles it. Wherever it already burns, he throws on fuel. His hope is that these smaller fires, coaxed and joined and spread, might one day merge into a single blaze, large enough to consume everything, the great and final conflagration he lives to see. And he pursues this with all the terrible skill of the being he once was. Remember that Aatrox was the greatest warrior the world ever produced, the finest of the Sunborn, the most feared of the Darkin. That skill did not leave him when he fell. If anything, ages of hatred honed it to a killing edge. On the battlefield, he is a force that mortal armies cannot hope to match, a towering figure of ruined divinity who wades through soldiers like a scythe through wheat. But the true danger of Aatrox is not only in his blade. It is in the purpose that guides the blade, the patient, endless drive to turn every fight he touches into a step toward the end of all things. Among the many enemies Aatrox has made across his long return, one conflict stands out for what it revealed about his power and his purpose, and that is his clash with Pantheon. To understand it, you have to know that Pantheon was not merely a warrior, but the mortal host of the aspect of war, one of the great celestial powers of Targon, a fragment of the heavens given form on earth. The man who carried that power was named Atreus, and when the aspect of war dwelt within him, he was among the mightiest champions the mortal world could field, a living piece of the cosmos armed and armoured for battle. When Aatrox came for him, it was not a fight between equals in the ordinary sense. It was a Darkin against an aspect, a fallen god against a celestial one, and Aatrox won. He did what should have been impossible. He struck down the aspect of war, killing the celestial power itself, snuffing out a fragment of the heavens as though it were a candle. It was a staggering act, proof of just how dangerous he had become, a demonstration that even the great powers of Targon were not safe from the world ender. In that moment, Aatrox showed the world that his war against existence was not the raving of a broken thing, but a genuine threat to the highest orders of creation. But something survived that Aatrox did not expect. Atreus, the mortal who had hosted the aspect, did not die when the celestial power within him was slain. He lived, hollowed out, stripped of the divinity that had defined him, an ordinary man left standing in the ruins of a god. By every reckoning, he should have been nothing, a broken vessel with his purpose torn away. Yet he endured, and in his endurance, he became something new. A mortal who would eventually take up the mantle of war again through sheer stubborn will, reclaiming through grief and fury what had been stolen from him. Where Aatrox had killed a god, Atreus survived to become one on his own terms, and he carried a hatred of the Darkin that would drive him back towards the being who had unmade him. The clash between them holds a strange mirror at its heart. Here are two beings, both shaped by the loss of what defined them, both hollowed out by tragedy, both remade into something harder than they had been. But where Aatrox turned his ruin outward into a desire to end all things, Atreus turned his inward into a desperate will to endure and to fight back. They are, in a sense, two answers to the same terrible question. What do you do when everything that made you is taken away? One chose oblivion, the other chose defiance. And so the world ender found in the man he thought he had destroyed one of the few beings in all the world with the will and the reason to stand against him. Aatrox is not the only Darkin still moving through the world, and to understand where he stands, it helps to look at the others who share his curse, because they show us the different shapes a fallen champion can take. They were all born of the same catastrophe, all raised as protectors and broken into monsters and sealed into weapons. Yet each has walked a different road since returning, and set against them, the particular emptiness of Aatrox comes into sharper focus. There is Varus, whose story is one of the strangest among them. His prison was a bow, and it was opened not by a warrior hungry for power, but by two hunters, lovers who came to that dark place seeking a way to save each other from a terrible fate. When they touched the sealed weapon, the Darkin within poured into them both, and the result was not a simple possession, but a fusion. Three beings bound together in one body, the ancient Darkin and the two mortal lovers, their wills tangled and at war. Varus is a creature divided against himself, the monster fighting to erase the two souls trapped alongside him, while those souls cling to each other and to the memory of who they were. His is a horror of intimacy, of a fall that swept up the innocent along with the guilty. There is Rast, sealed within a scythe, whose fate became bound to a young and ambitious warrior who took up the weapon believing he could master it. That warrior is strong-willed, trained in deadly arts, and certain of his own dominance. But Rast is patient, and Rast is old, and the Darkin whispers constantly from within the blade, wearing at his wielder's resolve, waiting for the moment when the young man's will falters, and the scythe can claim him fully. It is a slow contest between them, a struggle for a single body, the mortal striving to bend the weapon to his purpose, and the Darkin striving to consume him from the inside. Each believes he will win. Only one of them can. And there is Naafiri, perhaps the most unusual of them all. Naafiri was sealed away like the others, but upon awakening found no single mortal strong enough to serve as a proper host. Rather than perish or wait, this Darkin did something none of the others thought to do. Naafiri poured itself into a desert hound, and then into its pack, spreading a single consciousness across many bodies, becoming a mind that lives inside a hunting pack that moves and thinks as one, where the other Darkin are defined by isolation and by the erasure of others. Naafiri found a kind of strength in numbers, in connection, in the bond of the pack. It is a stranger and in some ways gentler fate, a fallen god who learned to live as many rather than as one, and who came into the world seeking others of its kind. Set these against Aatrox, and the difference is clear. Varus is torn apart by the souls he cannot escape. Rahast schemes and waits for a single body. Naafiri seeks connection and kinship. Each of them, in their own way, still wants something within the world, whether it is dominance or freedom or belonging. Aatrox wants none of it. He has passed beyond wanting anything the world can offer, because the only thing he desires is for the world to stop offering, to fall silent, to end. Among the Darkin, he is the one who has travelled furthest down the road of despair, the one for whom even the grim satisfactions of the others hold no appeal. The Darkin were never truly united, and Aatrox least of all belongs to any brotherhood. He does not lead the others, and they do not follow him. They are scattered across the world, each caught in his own struggle, each pursuing his own broken purpose, bound together only by the shared origin of their fall and the shared curse of what they became. If Naafiri dreams of gathering the Darkin together, that dream finds little answer in Aatrox, who has moved past kinship as he has moved past every other tie. He is a solitary force, singular in his skill and singular in his aim, walking his own path toward the ending he believes is the only mercy left. What, then, might Aatrox do next? The honest answer is that his path leads always toward the same destination, no matter the particular battles along the way. He will seek stronger bodies, because his stolen forms decay, and he must always find new flesh to carry him forward, and he will seek out conflict wherever it burns, feeding the fires of war in the hope that they might one day merge into the final blaze he longs for. Always, he moves through the world as a catastrophe wearing the shape of a warrior, leaving ruin in his wake, drawing ever closer to the war large enough to end everything. And somewhere out there, the man he thought he had destroyed carries a grudge sharpened by loss and stands ready to oppose him, one of the few beings with the will to try. There is no comfortable resolution waiting at the end of his story, because his story has not ended, and by its very nature, resists ending. That is the terrible irony that sits at the center of everything Aatrox is. He wants an ending more than anything in creation, an oblivion that would swallow his suffering and quiet the eternal fury within him. And yet, he is a being who cannot die, trapped in a cycle of decay and renewal, chasing a final silence that stays forever out of reach. Every host he burns through, every war he kindles, every step he takes toward the end of the world is a step toward the death he cannot grant himself by any simpler means. Which brings us back to the being he was all those ages ago, standing at the head of gleaming columns beneath the Shuriman sun. That is the weight his whole story carries, the memory of the Protector folded inside the Destroyer. To look at Aatrox now, the world ender, the killer of gods, the being who wants to burn everything down to nothing, and to remember that he began as a hero who believed in the light, is to understand the full shape of his tragedy. He did not choose this from the beginning. He was made into it, worn into it, broken into it, across a fall so long and so complete that by the end there was nothing left of the champion but the shape of his grief, turned into a weapon aimed at all of creation. It is worth slowing down here and letting the whole arc of that fall settle in the mind, because the pieces of it matter more when they are held together than when they are counted one by one. Aatrox did not become the world ender in a single, terrible choice. There was no moment where he stood at a crossroads and turned deliberately toward evil. Instead, there was a long series of losses, each one taking something from him, each one leaving him a little emptier, until the being who remained had been carved down to nothing but grief and fury. That is what makes his story so heavy. This is not the story of a villain who chose to be cruel, but the story of a good thing that the world slowly wore down into a weapon. Return for a moment to the age when he was still a protector and consider how complete his devotion was. To be one of the Ascended was not a job or a title that could be set aside. It was a transformation of the whole self, a remaking of body and purpose together, so that the duty he carried was not something he did, but something he was. When he stood at the head of his columns, when courage spread from him like warmth, that was not an act. It came from the core of him, from a belief so deep it had reshaped his very flesh. And that is exactly why its loss destroyed him so completely. You cannot take away a belief that deep without taking away the being who held it. When his faith died, the Aatrox who had held it died with it, and what climbed out of the wreckage was something else wearing his shape. The war against the void deserves to be understood not only as a series of battles, but as a slow poisoning of the soul, because that is what it was for the ones who fought it longest. An ordinary war ends. Even the worst of mortal conflicts eventually burns itself out, and the survivors go home to grieve and to rebuild. The war against the void offered no such mercy. It stretched on beyond the endurance of the ones who fought it, and it offered no clean victories and no lasting ground. Only the endless labor of holding back a tide that never truly receded. To fight in it was to live in a state of constant loss, watching everything you valued erode a little more with each passing day, knowing that even your greatest efforts brought only a brief delay. A mind can only take so much of that before it begins to change, and the minds of the Ascended, for all their strength, were still minds. And then there was the particular horror of the enemy itself, the way the void reached past the body and into the spirit. To face an ordinary foe is to face something you can understand, a creature with wants and fears, a thing that can be beaten because it shares your world. To face the void is to face the negation of your world, a hunger that exists only to unmake, a presence that whispers to the deepest part of you that all your struggles are meaningless, that everything you love is temporary, that beneath the beauty of creation lies only an emptiness waiting to reclaim it. Staring into that, day after day, is a kind of slow argument against hope. And the longer Aatrox stared, the more of the argument he came to believe. By the time the war was won, if won is even the right word for so ruinous an outcome, the champions who survived had been taught a lesson they could never unlearn. They had learned that goodness offers no protection, that faith can be broken, that the highest devotion can be repaid with the deepest suffering. They had learned that the universe does not reward its heroes and does not spare its saints. Some carried that lesson quietly, as a wound that ached but did not consume. Others, and Aatrox was chief among them, let it become the whole truth of their existence, the lens through which they saw everything that came after. When the Empire fell and even duty was stripped away, the transformation into the Darkin was not so much a new fall as the completion of one already long underway. The blood magic, the twisting of the body, the descent into conquest and slaughter, these were the outward signs of a change that had already happened within. The noble form gave way to the monstrous form because the noble spirit had already given way to a monstrous grief. Aatrox reached for forbidden power because he had nothing left to lose and nothing left to protect. And the power reshaped him into an image of what he had become inside, a beautiful and terrible instrument of destruction where a guardian had once stood. Dwell for a while on the imprisonment, because it is the part of his story that is hardest to truly grasp, and the part that explains the depth of what he became. We can imagine a year of confinement. We can, with effort, imagine 10. But Aatrox endured ages, spans of time so vast that the word centuries barely begins to describe them, and he endured them fully awake, fully aware, with nothing to occupy his mind but the fact of his own imprisonment. There was no sleep in that sword, no merciful fog, no passage of unconscious time. There was only the endless present, moment after identical moment, each one felt in full, each one adding to a weight that never lifted. A mortal mind would have shattered and scattered under that weight, dissolving into madness or blessed emptiness. But Aatrox could not even have that release, because he was not a mortal mind, and because the sword held him whole. He remained himself, or what was left of himself, intact and conscious through all of it, and so he had ages to refine his hatred. Ages to turn his grief over and over, until every soft edge had worn away. Ages to arrive at conclusions about the world and his place in it that no shorter suffering could have reached. When at last a hand lifted the blade and freed him, the being that emerged had been distilled by that long dark into something pure and terrible, a hatred with no dilution left in it at all. This is why his desire to end the world is not the raving of a simple monster, but the settled conclusion of a mind that has thought about nothing else for longer than kingdoms last. To Aatrox, existence is not neutral, and it is not good. It is a machine for producing suffering, a place where the finest beings are broken, and the deepest devotions are betrayed, and even death. The last refuge of the wretched, can be taken away. From that view, ending everything is not cruelty. It is mercy, the only mercy such a world can offer, a final silence that would spare all things the fate that was inflicted on him. He does not see himself as a destroyer of a good world. He sees himself as the deliverer of a bad one. And there is a cold logic to it that is far more disturbing than any mere hunger for slaughter. Hold both of these truths at once, because the whole tragedy lives in the space between them. Aatrox is genuinely monstrous. The wars he kindles are real, the lives he ends are real, the threat he poses to gods and mortals alike is real. He is not to be pitied into forgiveness or excused into harmlessness. And yet he is also, unmistakably, a victim, a being who was made to be good and then broken by the very world he served, whose evil is the shape his suffering took when it had nowhere else to go. He is both the horror and the wounded thing beneath the horror, and to see only one of those is to miss the whole of what he is. There is a strange stillness at the center of him now, beneath all the fury and the war. He is a being who has stopped wanting anything except the end, and there is a kind of terrible peace in that, the peace of someone who has let go of every hope but one. He does not scheme for power or grasp for pleasure or dream of a throne, but simply moves toward oblivion with the patient certainty of the very old and the very tired, kindling his fires, wearing his stolen bodies, waiting for the war that will finally quiet everything. In that stillness, you can almost see the ghost of the warrior he was, the one who once moved with such certainty toward a very different goal, when the thing he served was life instead of its ending. And so his existence continues, a cycle without resolution, a hunt without satisfaction, a purpose that can never truly be fulfilled, because the ending he seeks is the one thing his cursed nature denies him. He will burn through host after host, and kindle war after war, and he will clash with those who rise to oppose him, the man who once was Pantheon chief among them, enduring whatever defeats they hand him, because he cannot do otherwise, because he cannot die. The world ender walks on toward an end that stays forever just out of reach, carrying the weight of everything he has lost, seeking the silence that will not come. There is one more cruelty in his story that deserves its own quiet consideration, and it is the cruelty of being forgotten. The world that made Aatrox, that raised the Great Disk and forged the Ascended and sent them to fight the Void, is gone. Shurima crumbled into the sand ages ago, its golden age fading first into legend and then into little more than dust and rumour. The people who walk the world now, the ones who might one day stumble upon his blade, carry no memory of the empire he served, or the war he fought, or the champion he had been. To them, the age of the Sunborn is a story so old it has worn smooth, if they have heard of it at all. And so when a wielder finds his sword in the present age, they see none of it. They do not see the protector of Shurima, or the hero of the Void War, or the tragedy of the Fall. They see a magnificent weapon, ancient and powerful, and they think of what such a blade might do for them, the battles they might win, the glory they might claim. They have no way of knowing that the thing they hold contains a god of grief who has been waiting ages for exactly this moment. The gap between what the sword truly is and what its finder believes it to be is the trap that has claimed every one of them, and it is a trap the world's forgetting keeps freshly baited. Picture such a moment, quiet and ordinary at first. A warrior comes upon the blade, perhaps in some ruin, perhaps at the end of a long search, perhaps by pure chance. They lift it, and it is perfect in their hands, balanced and beautiful, and humming with power. For a heartbeat they feel like the hero of their own story, chosen by fortune, armed at last with a weapon worthy of their ambitions. And in that same heartbeat unseen, the god within begins to stir, reaching into them, testing the strength of their will, beginning the slow conquest that will end with the warrior gone, and Aatrox wearing their body toward the next war. Every triumph in that moment is already a doom. Every dream of glory is already someone else's grave. The forgetting works in another direction too, and it deepens his isolation into something almost complete. Because Aatrox remembers. Whatever else the ages have done to him, they have not granted him the mercy of forgetting what he was. He carries the memory of the Shuriman's son, of the faith he once held, of the beings he once protected, and he carries it into a world that remembers none of it, that cannot mourn what it never knew it lost. He is the last living record of an age that has vanished, a witness to a golden time that survives now only inside the mind of the monster that time produced. There is a terrible loneliness in that, in being the only one left who knows the full weight of what has passed, and in knowing that even that knowledge will end only when he does, which is to say, perhaps never. Consider, too, what it means for a being to be defined entirely by a purpose he can never complete. Most creatures live toward goals they might reach. A warrior seeks victory and may find it. A ruler seeks a throne and may claim it. Even the wretched seek an end to their suffering, and in death may find it. But Aatrox seeks an oblivion that his own nature forbids him. His entire existence points toward a destination he cannot arrive at by any ordinary means, and so his life has become a kind of endless approach, a forever drawing near to a threshold he can never cross alone. He must remake the entire world into a war large enough to swallow even him, because nothing smaller will do the work he needs done. It is the most extreme purpose imaginable, born from the most extreme despair, and it commits him to a struggle without foreseeable end. That is why every battle he fights carries a weight beyond the battle itself. When Aatrox clashes with an army, he is not only killing soldiers, he is feeding the fire he hopes will one day consume creation. When he clashes with a champion like the man who once was Pantheon, he is not only defending himself, he is contesting the very question of whether the world will be allowed to continue at all. His enemies fight for their lives, for their homes, for the people they love, while Aatrox fights for the end of all such things. And this difference in scale is what makes him so uniquely terrible. He is not another warlord seeking his share of the world, but a being who has decided the world should not exist, and who possesses the skill and the endurance to make a genuine attempt at proving himself right. And still, beneath all of that vast and cosmic ambition, there remains something small and human at the root of him, something that makes the whole towering horror comprehensible. It is grief. It is the grief of a being who loved something and lost it, who believed in something and was betrayed, who gave everything and was punished for the giving. Strip away the ages and the blood magic and the killing of gods, and at the very center you find a broken heart, one that has grown so vast and so poisoned that it now encompasses the whole of creation in its mourning. Aatrox wants to end the world because, in a sense, his world already ended long ago, and everything he does now is the long echo of that first unbearable loss. This is what makes his story more than a tale of a powerful monster, and it is why it lingers in the mind the way it does. We understand, on some level, the impulse that drives him, even as we recoil from where it has led. We know what it is to lose something we believed in. We know what it is to feel that the world has been unjust. Most of us find ways to carry those wounds and go on. Aatrox found no such way, and his wound grew until it swallowed him, and then it kept growing, reaching out to swallow everything else. He is what despair looks like when it is given eternity, and the power of a god, a warning written across the ages of what grief can become when nothing is left to soften it. It helps, before we draw everything together, to picture what it actually means to stand against him, because the scale of the threat is easy to state and hard to feel. Aatrox on the field of battle is not a swordsman to be duelled or a general to be outmaneuvered. He is a catastrophe with a purpose, a towering figure of ruined divinity who fights with the accumulated skill of the greatest warrior the world ever forged. Sharpened further by ages of hatred with nothing to blunt it. Armies that would break a lesser foe simply feed him. Champions who would end a lesser threat find themselves facing a being who has already killed a god and who cannot by any ordinary means be made to stay down. The armies that meet him learn quickly that he does not fight the way mortal enemies fight. He does not seek to win ground or to claim a prize or to force a surrender, because none of those things interest him. He seeks only ruin, the spreading of it, the deepening of it, and so there is no bargain that can be struck with him, and no victory that can satisfy him short of the end of everything. To face Aatrox is to face a foe who has already decided that both of you should cease to exist, and who is patient enough and mighty enough to keep working toward that end across battle after battle, defeat after defeat, body after body. And this is the shape his campaign takes, quiet and relentless beneath the noise of the wars it feeds. He moves from conflict to conflict across the world, drawn to the places where hatred already burns, adding his weight to every quarrel he can reach. A border dispute becomes a slaughter. A simmering grudge becomes an open war. Wherever he passes, the violence that was already there grows deeper and harder to stop, and he moves on before the full cost of his passing is even understood, leaving others to burn in the fires he has fed. He is in no hurry, because he has nothing but time, and every small war he worsens is another ember thrown toward the great blaze he means one day to light. There is a patience in this that is more frightening than any fury. A being in a rush can be waited out, exhausted, outlasted, but Aatrox cannot. He has already outlasted an empire, a war against the void, and ages sealed in the dark. He can afford to lose 100 battles if the losing feeds the wars he wants, and he can afford to be driven back 100 times if each retreat only delays a purpose that has no deadline. Time, which grinds mortals down and wears away their resolve, is the one thing Aatrox has in endless supply, and he has bent all of it toward a single end. That is the being the world must reckon with, and it is against that backdrop of patient, spreading ruin that his deepest contradiction comes fully into view. So we come, at last, to the heart of what Aatrox is, the contradiction that holds his entire story together and gives it its strange and lasting power. He is an immortal being who wants, more than anything in all of creation, to die. That single sentence contains the whole of his tragedy, and everything we have walked through leads back to it. The war he fought, the fall he suffered, the ages he spent sealed and conscious in the dark, the endless cycle of stolen bodies, the vast and ruinous purpose he now pursues. All of it flows from a being who has been denied the one thing the smallest and most fragile mortal is promised: an ending. Think of how backward that is, and how cruel. Death is the fate that every living thing fears, the shadow that hangs over all mortal joy, the price of being alive at all. Aatrox would give anything for it. He has been made deathless, and instead of a blessing it has become the deepest of curses, a sentence of eternal endurance handed to a being who has nothing left he wishes to endure for. Where mortals cling to life and flee from death, he flees from life and reaches for death, and he cannot close the distance no matter how far he runs. His immortality is not a gift, It is the bars of his cage, and he has been rattling them for ages with no answer. And here is the final, terrible turn of his logic, the conclusion he has reached after longer thought than any mortal mind could survive. If he cannot die alone, if no ordinary ending is permitted him, then perhaps the only way to reach oblivion is to end everything at once. To build a war so total that not even he can survive it. To drag the whole of creation down into the silence he cannot enter by any smaller door. He does not seek to destroy the world out of simple malice. He seeks to destroy it because he has come to believe that its destruction may be the only path to his own. His war against all things is, at its root, a suicide attempt on a cosmic scale. The reaching of a being who wants to stop existing and can find no way to stop that does not take everything else with him. Sit with the sorrow of that, because it is the truest note in his whole story. A hero was raised to protect the world. The world broke him. And now the broken thing that remains wants to unmake the world, not chiefly out of revenge, though revenge is surely part of it, but because he sees in the world's ending the only release from a suffering that will otherwise never stop. The Protector became the Destroyer, and the Destroyer's dearest wish is not power or dominion, but rest, the rest that only oblivion can bring. He wants to lay down a weight he has carried for ages beyond counting, and the only place he can imagine setting it down is in the ashes of everything. There is no neat resolution to offer, no moment where the story closes and the lesson is drawn and the matter is settled. Because Aatrox is still out there in the world of Rune Terror, still walking, still burning, still seeking. His sword still waits to be found by the next warrior who dreams of glory. His hatred still burns as cold and patient as it did when he first climbed free of the blade. The man who once was Pantheon still carries his grudge, and somewhere the fires of some war smoulder that Aatrox may yet fan into the blaze he longs for. The story continues, because it must, because its central figure cannot bring it to the end he craves, and so it goes on, a wound that will not close, a fall that has not finished falling. What remains with us, when we set the story down, is the image of the contradiction itself, held quietly in the mind. An immortal who wants to die, a protector who became a destroyer, a being of the sun who now moves like a shadow, wearing the flesh of the dead, carrying the memory of a world that forgot him, reaching for an ending that his own nature forever denies. He is one of the greatest warriors the world of Rune Terror ever produced, and the finest thing he ever did was fight to save that world, and the last thing he wants now is to see it burn. Between those two truths lies the whole of Aatrox, the tragedy of the World Ender, a god who lost everything and now wants only for everything to be lost, so that at last, in the final silence, he might lose himself as well. And that is the story of Aatrox, from the golden age of Shurima to the endless dark of the World Ender, a fall so long and so complete that the hero at the top and the horror at the bottom can scarcely be recognized as the same being, though they are. He began as a shield for his people and became a blade aimed at all of creation, and the distance between those two things is filled with more grief than any single being was ever meant to hold. Rest easy now, and let the sands of that ancient empire settle back into stillness, and remember, as the last thought before sleep, that even the darkest of monsters was once, long ago, someone who only wanted to protect the ones he loved.